First of all, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it. I find your work really interesting, and I've been super stoked to talk to you. Um, I I guess first I am interested in you. So I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about yourself and your political background.
Um, well, I grew up in suburban New Jersey, not far from New York City, a town known for its liberal politics and its racial diversity. It was often said growing up that people move to Montclair, New Jersey, often if they're gay or if they're in a mixed race relationship. It's known as like a bug light for that kind of toleration and acceptance. And that's where I grew up. Basically, everyone was a default Democrat. I knew one Republican, I think, um, my whole life, zero through probably 16 years old. And my politics were broadly Democrat, broadly liberal. I grew up thinking Bush was incredibly dumb, and Christianity had no place in our politics and was deranging people, which a lot of that I still think is true. Um, but broadly, I grew up with um, the strong sense that, certainly on the topic of race, that basically Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech hit the nail on the head in terms of the moral ideal we should all be striving for, which is to say that race, skin color it's only skin deep. Who you are is who you are underneath. Um, I didn't get any of the sort of recent wave of race conscious racial justice ideas until maybe 2012 or 2013, when I began to be taught that black people and white people fundamentally can't understand each other because white people haven't been through what we've been through. That America, that it's not just the case that there are racist people that we always must oppose, but the system itself is racist and must be overturned. Excuse me. Um, that there's something called white privilege, which is pervasive, and needs to be singled out among all the various kinds of privilege that human beings have. All of these ideas were not ideas I grew up with, but they're ideas I encountered in my late adolescence and was quite attracted to for some time. Um, and long story short, I found increasingly that I didn't believe in these ideas. I thought that they were wrong, and that more or less what I was taught as a child, that race actually doesn't matter, and the people who, the first person to make it matter is always the one in the wrong, whether that person is a classic white racist or, a racial justice warrior telling you that the color of your skin is all important in a more allegedly enlightened way.
Hmm. This is going to sound like kind of a dumb question, but I think it's actually worth talking about because of the way that words are used or misused so often these days. What is racism?
I don't know. Um, Racism, if you go back and see what people like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin and the other civil rights leaders thought the word racism meant in in the early '60s, they said that it means when one person says to another, "I don't recognize you as the same as me because of your race." That's a very intuitive definition for most people. No doubt it's blurry at the edges, like any concept is, but it's pretty clear to people what that kind of racism means. But then in 1967, there was a book written called Black Power by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, which used the phrase institutional racism for the first time, which, there's many synonyms for it: structural racism, systemic racism. And the idea here was that racism is not reducible to individuals. It's not reducible to the attitudes that one human being holds towards another, whether conscious or not, but it somehow is a feature of the system itself. Um, and so what that has done is, I think it's, as Douglas Murray often says, a writer I admire, um, the anti-racist movement and the anti-fascist movement has had a supply and demand problem, which is that the number of true racists and fascists used to be huge, and now it's very, very small. And like any movement that actually achieves its aims, any movement that is in favor of reducing something, to the extent that it's successful, it obviates the need for its own existence. It's a sad paradox of laudable organizations. If you're Mothers Against Drunk Driving, to take a random example, and you actually succeed in reducing drunk driving by 90%, you kind of eliminate the need for your own existence, which is, no kind of reward for doing great work. So I'm sympathetic to that paradox, but what it's meant is that the definition of racism has expanded and expanded and expanded to the point where now, basically anything can be called racist, and no one will challenge it. If white people move into a neighborhood, that's gentrification and it's racist. If white people move out of a neighborhood, that's white flight and it's racist. Much of it doesn't make sense. It's not the kind of racism that the civil rights movement was about fighting. And frankly, it diminishes the power of the word racism, which is a very important word.
Why do you think that, people who actually are racist, why do you think that people are racist? What's the root of that?
Um, that's a good question. It depends what kind of racism you're talking about. Um,
I mean, what you would define as racist? Let's say that.
so there's even my definition of racist has different facets, because there's a subconscious prejudice you could have against certain people. Um, and that those kind of prejudices can be often formed on the basis of pattern recognition. So, it's extremely taboo to say so, but the fact is, any measure of subconscious bias we find that white people and black people both often tend to have an anti-black bias. Um, and what that says is, to me, is that it's not simply a matter of white people um, absorbing too many racist stereotypes. It's not simply a matter of Fox News only showing the black murderers and never the white murderers. It's not simply a matter of Hollywood, um, only showing black people as butlers and servants and never as intelligent. A lot of that stuff has been true for most of American history, but all of that stuff has been on the wane. And it's really hard to find racist stereotyping anywhere in mainstream media in 2020. I don't think I would have said that even in 1980. Certainly not in 1960 or 1940. But so then the question remains, why is it still the case that too many people do have anti-black biases, including many black people? Um, and I think the answer to that is probably that uh, people are picking up on patterns in behavior that they notice at a subconscious level are different. Um, the moment you begin looking at crime rates by race, you discover very unsettling facts. You know, just for one, black people are 14% of America, but suffer and commit 52% of homicides. Um, any crime, almost any crime you can think of, not all of them, but most of them, there's a huge racial disparity there, and that's the tip of the iceberg of the average behavioral differences between different populations. And a lot of subconscious racial biases are the brain creating a crude heuristic based on experience. And that's very tough to grapple with, because that means that at some level, even when you get rid of the, ideological racism, good old fashioned white supremacy, which is like the stated explicit belief that white people are superior, even when you get rid of that, there's this subconscious kernel of racism that's much more difficult to get rid of.
Would you say that America is a racist country?
It would depend what you mean by that. I mean, so when people say that, I think many people have a very provincial view. Um, if you visited anywhere else in the world, I think you would recognize that America is one of the least racist places on earth. So you can call it a racist country, because there are racists in it, because racism has played a huge role in American political history, because we had slavery for 200 plus years, Jim Crow, lynchings, etc. If that suffices to make America a racist country, then I suppose on that definition, America is a racist country. But um, I can't honestly look at it and see how America ranks poorly relative to the rest of the world. For one example, here's a fact that a lot of people don't know. The Arab world enslaved Africans for about 1,000 years, around 14 million by most scholarly estimates, which is right up there with the Western slave trade. It lasted longer. It took longer to be abolished. Saudi Arabia didn't abolish slavery until the 1960s, when we were figuring out civil rights. And the slavery was disproportionately of black Africans. And to this day, the word for a black person, the colloquial Arabic word for a black person, is the colloquial Arabic word for slave, abid. There are in many Arab countries there are candies, little bobbleheads with chocolate, little baubles of chocolate that they call slave heads. So that's where the Arab world is currently with anti-black racism. If you want to look at China, you're going to find some deeply backwards and disturbing attitudes about black people. So, any actual if you compare the America to your imagined utopia, you're going to find that it's a deeply flawed and disgusting and racist country. If you compare it to the actual alternatives on Earth, you will find that it is one of the most racially progressive places on Earth. And it's no coincidence, in my view, that it's the number one destination for black and brown migrants all across the world.
Mm-hmm. I really liked what you wrote about intersectionality for Quillette. I'm just going to read a paragraph from that piece for people who haven't read it, obviously. So Kimberly Crenshaw, who, I was exposed to intersectionality theory and this kind of thing in university a lot, because I did a BA and master's degree in women's studies, which became the gender studies department. And so I understand how we sort of ingest these ideas without really thinking very critically about them. And not that I don't necessarily think what she wrote was flawed, but in any case, so you wrote, Kimberly Crenshaw's original intent was narrow. She did not mean for intersectionality to become an all-encompassing thought system with its own epistemology, politics, aesthetics, and more. She has indeed distanced herself from some of intersectionality's modern purveyors, criticizing those who see it as a grand theory of everything. Nonetheless, that is exactly what it has become. The main problem with intersectionality is that it's an armchair philosophy. Its purveyors do not look at the social world, gather evidence about it, and formulate theories based on what they see. Instead, they pontificate about the world from a distance. So, I mean, I totally agree with that. It seems to just be used in like a super blanket and really superficial way, to be honest. Both to like virtue signal that you're anti-racist or, you know, even not transphobic or whatever it is. And I think to kind of like avoid getting into the crevices and avoid having real conversations. So, you know, you make the point that intersectionality as it's used today by activists doesn't describe the world very well. I wonder if you can expand on that a bit.
I was at several Black Lives Matter protests today, and there were some people that were specifically chanting that Black women's lives matter. Um, and you know, this strikes me as interesting because there are, I've often heard people say that we need to pay special attention to, say, Black women, the problem of Black women in prison or Black women killed by the cops. And you know, they'll divert the conversation to that as the quote unquote most vulnerable group, right? And I think to myself, has this person ever looked at the statistics on whether it's Black men or Black women overwhelmingly in the prison system? Because last I checked, over 90% of those Black bodies in jail that you know that a racial justice activist would want to care about are men. 90% of people killed by the cops are men. Intersectionality, theoretically, its theory does not allow for the idea that men are disproportionately harmed in a particular sector of American society, be that prison, be that by the cops. Yet it's obvious, both from common sense and from statistics, that there are such sectors. So that's the point I was making. Um, Intersectionality works very well if you want to talk about domestic violence. It doesn't work. It doesn't work well for whole other swaths of reality. Um, and that was the point I was trying to make there.
Mm-hmm. Um, I how big a problem actually is police violence against? I mean, I could say police violence against Black people, but let's say specifically Black men. You can talk about police violence against Black women if you like, also in America.
So I guess there are two ways to look at it. That you can look at it in absolute terms, or you could look at it relative to white people. In absolute terms, uh, any your likelihood of getting shot and killed by the cops is on par with your likelihood of getting struck by lightning, no matter who you are. But if you want to look at it relative to white people, there are disparities. So, for example, Roland Fryer has done the most rigorous study of this, which is that cops are more likely to use non-lethal force, that is, to rough up a suspect if he is Black rather than white, everything else held equal. And that creates a very deep sense of anger in Black people for feeling that they have been, rightly feeling that they've been unfairly treated, that cops are quicker to suspect them, not just cops, but other civilians as well. And that is true. And it creates a huge amount of resentment. At the same time, it's actually not true that the police are more likely to pull the trigger on a Black suspect. And that was the other thing Roland Fryer found, which he called the most surprising result of his career. Just to give the most recent statistics, in 2019, 41 Americans unarmed were killed by the cops. 9 of those were Black. 19 of those were white. So Black people comprised a little over 20% of those unarmed killed by the cops, 14% of the population. To begin, that's not a huge disparity, but once you control for the fact that the average Black person is 10 years younger than the average white person, and young people are more likely to get into these altercations with the cops, once you control for the fact that the crime rate is much higher, there's no disparity at all in terms of being shot and killed by the cops. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, it is premised on a half-truth. And the half-truth is that, yes, the police mistreat black people disproportionately, but no, they are not more likely to shoot and kill black suspects.
So, so what do you think about the current protests and the uprisings that are going on now in response to George Floyd?
I'm of two minds about them. On the one hand, I think there is a systemic problem with corruption in American police departments. Police lie routinely to protect their own. If there's no video of the incident, they come up with a story that paints the cops in the most flattering light and gets them out of misconduct. It's often police chiefs deciding whether to discipline their own people, which guarantees that they're going to have a bias towards their own. They're not impartial investigators, in other words. Not all cops are required to wear body cams, and they ought to be. The doctrine of qualified immunity has, many people are, seeking to get rid of that because of the perception that it gives cops too much leeway when lawsuits are brought against them, and that may be true. I'm not an expert on that issue. Um, so there are serious problems to solve with the cops, and the Black Lives Matter movement is, I'm not going to say it's the only real game in town for police reform, but it's the main game in town. So if I'm someone who's for police reform, which I am, I can't be totally against Black Lives Matter. I have to support them in that vein. At the same time, um, and the one other thing I will say is that they're a peaceful movement. Um, there's rioting around the country right now, and it's absolutely horrible. And I can't stand the excuse making for it one bit. But the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black Lives Matter protesters make a point of condemning violence and trying to restrain violence. So I don't pin that the looting on them. They have a particular set of beliefs, and they're trying to push for them in the most noble way that they can. However, their biggest fundamental belief is wrong. It's not the case that it's open season on black men being shot by the cops. It's not true. Like, with George Floyd, this is one of the most horrific videos I've ever seen in my life of anything, fictitious or real. However, there was another video from 2016 of a white man named Tony Timpa in Dallas, Texas. And a cop restrains him, puts him belly down on the pavement, puts his knee on his upper back, and suffocates him to death. Almost exactly the same way Floyd died. His name was Tony Timpa. He was begging for his life as they killed him. And in fact, the cops were joking. They were making jokes the whole time that they were killing this guy. And he actually died right there on the pavement. Floyd went unconscious but died later. In some sense, it's slightly worse than what happened to Floyd because of the joking about it and just the casualness. I suppose both were casual, but the point I'm making here is that these videos never go viral. When it's a white cop doing it to a white suspect, as happened to Tony Timpa, or Daniel Shaver, killed while lying face down on the floor begging for his life, or Dylan Noble, shot and killed at point blank range unarmed after walking out the driver's seat of his car. All these white men get killed by the police. It gets captured on video. The videos don't go viral. They don't spark protests or riots. And so all of these people, they're almost victims of the coverage bias themselves because, they've never seen these videos of the white guys getting treated the same way. And so when it happens to a black person, the media has trained us to respond as if our people are being uniquely hunted. And then that's how we respond. And so I can't help but feel that the Black Lives Matter movement is full of people who have been duped in some very fundamental way about the nature of the problem with the police. The problem is not that they're racist, it's that they're corrupt.
So when black men are killed by the cops, why? What's happening there? Is there any difference between what's happening when, say, a cop kills a black man versus when a cop kills a white man?
The question can't really be answered in the abstract. Um, like I said, for every video, for every video of a black man being killed by a cop unarmed, there is an equally appalling and similar video of a white man being killed unarmed, often a video from the same year. Um, and so, if you want to develop a theory about why these things happen, you have to account for why they happen to white people just as often. So I can't see a difference. I can neither prove nor disprove the claim that Alton Sterling or Philando Castile would not have been killed if he had been white. That could be true, but we only get to run history once. What I do know is that I've seen white people killed exactly the same way, and these videos never get shared because nobody cares.
So tell me a bit about what's happening where you are. You're in New York, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and you said you've been to some of the protests. What was that experience like?
The protests, there are huge protests happening all the time, every day, and they are basically entirely peaceful. Um, the 99% of people there want it to be peaceful. The organizers emphasize that they don't want to antagonize the police or as they say, engage with the police, which is slightly different, and that they're there to peacefully advocate for what they think is right. And the basic message is that the police are racist. Fuck the cops. Um, remember the names of all the black people who have been killed by the cops. Um, those are the basic chants that are happening. No justice, no peace. Fuck these racist ass police. That was the main chant. And the protests go an hour or so, depending on the protest, and then it's over. And they're very diverse. There white people, black people, Asian, Hispanic, all kinds of people at these protests.
Yeah. And I mean, based on what I've seen online, it's looked like, I mean, essentially exactly what you're saying. So I've seen lots of footage of black activists asking these kind of like young, mostly white anarchists or Antifa or whatever, these young white males to stop the destruction or looting or violence. Have you seen any violence or looting or rioting?
No, I haven't seen any. But yeah, the the thrust of the spirit of these protests is nonviolent and um, would condemn and actively try to restrain any people that were being violent. Um, the one thing I will say is that there is a good 5 or 10% of protesters that every time they pass a cop will put up a middle finger, say "fuck you, pig." Um, so there is that kind of taunting, and almost begging or wanting the cop to lose his cool. But that is, they're sort of lukewarm about that. They kind of discourage it, but they're not gonna kick you out of the protest if you do that. Because a lot of people actually do feel it, and they're glad when people antagonize the cops that way.
Right. I mean, so I've been seeing online a ton of progressives, I guess you could say. Like I'm in Canada too, so the context here is different politically and specifically with regard to race politics. So, but I suppose I'm seeing like, I would say mostly white kind of progressives or feminists from Canada, even the US, in the UK, supporting violence, supporting riots. I think not really understanding that the majority of these protests and protesters are peaceful, and not really understanding who is doing the rioting or looting, or the beating up of individuals. And it makes me really angry because my understanding of riots and this kind of violence is that it's not only unproductive, but it's actually really destructive to, Black communities or marginalized communities. If we look at 92, like the LA riots, that's obvious. And, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. said that he thought that increased riots would lead to a right wing takeover, and that fascists would be strengthened. Do you think that's true? I mean, what's your perspective on rioting, on looting, on violent protests?
Well, Martin Luther King was right that the riots helped get Nixon elected. Obviously, Nixon wasn't a fascist, but he was, um, not sympathetic to the cause, so to speak. Um, and the disorder, he ran on Law and Order, and that's part of what got him elected. Um, Absolutely right. I mean, violent protests it's not that they never work, but um, broadly they tend not to persuade people. They tend not to win hearts and minds. The civil rights leaders, um, they believed in nonviolence philosophically, but they always stressed that nonviolence was a political tactic. It was a tactic. They did it because it worked. They didn't do it, only because they were committed to it morally. Um, and it did work. And I don't know anything in America in 2020 that could be achieved by rioting that couldn't be achieved by large peaceful protests. Um, and you're right. You're right to say that rioting often destroys the very communities that all of the rioters would claim to be fighting for. I visited Ferguson, Missouri last year in 2019, and they saw riots in 2014 after Michael Brown was killed. And I saw rows of businesses that still have not returned 5 years later. Um, More than one of them was black owned. Mom and pop shops, not big chains, destroyed by the rioting and looting that never returned because the property is no longer valuable. People don't want to go to a place that's where they know rioting could occur at any moment. It's a horrible investment decision, and so we see this cycle of unemployment and you know just hopelessness and despair and abandoned buildings every other building in these neighborhoods. That doesn't go away after a year or even 5 years. Sometimes it lasts decades. And there are some cities that you can still see the evidence of the riots from 1967 and 68.
Um, what do you think, or I guess what do you hope, but if you have predictions, what do you think the result of these protests will be?
Um, that's a very good question.
Or what would you hope if you, I mean, we don't know, perhaps, but
I usually shy away from making predictions, but um, I would guess that a lot of police departments in cities are going to back off policing.
hmm.
Um, that would be one prediction that I'm I could make with a little bit of confidence.
I I mean, so what I've seen on my Instagram feed primarily today and last night was this Blackout Tuesday thing where all these people are just posting black squares, hashtag Blackout Tuesday, to support, I guess, the protests to support Black Lives Matter. Um, I wonder if you have any thoughts on those kinds of social media style actions.
I mean, to me, I haven't thought about it that much. It's a very cheap, it's activism on the cheap, requires no effort at educating oneself. Um, to me, if you are a person who claims to be an activist, who thinks you are making the world a better place, which I completely understand because I'm the same way. The primary, the what do they call it in medicine? The Hippocratic Oath. If there were a Hippocratic Oath of activism, it is to first educate yourself. The first job is always to make sure that you are not misled. And as as Feynman or whoever said, you're the easiest one to fool. Your job is to make sure that you are not fooled, knowing that you are the easiest person in the world to fool. And I think many people, rather than do that, they'd rather watch the one show that they get their news from, whether it's right wing or left wing, or just get their news from whatever their news feed is feeding them, which is by definition biased and not a representative sample. And posting a black square to show everyone that they care. I think it's much easier. It requires no effort. It requires no self-doubt, more importantly, because educating oneself is a constant battle with self-doubt, and nobody wants that. And so they post a black square.
And beyond educating yourself, is there anything that you would tell people to do in terms of actually making a difference and actually affecting change?
Like I said, educate yourself. The more you educate yourself, the more it will become clear what you ought to do and what you ought not to do.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if, people ever accuse you of downplaying the severity of racism or even, the history of racism in America because of your work.
Yes, they do.
And how do you respond to that?
I don't think I'm downplaying it, is the simple answer. I don't see which of my arguments. I think there's absolutely racism. Racism exists. It's real. I've never denied it. None of my arguments rest on the idea that there is no racism. People have that bizarre idea in their head. I don't know what else to say about that.
Yeah. And I also wonder if you think that we can eradicate racism, and if so, how we could go about doing that.
I have very different prior expectations of what humans are capable of and what we aren't. So, for example, would you ever suggest that we eradicate murder? No, no. I've never heard someone say that the mark of progress for our society would be to have a murder rate of 0.
Right.
And the reason for that is because no human society since the dawn of humanity has ever had a murder rate of 0. There have always been bad people, and no amount of good education and policies has been able to completely get rid of them. And so I have the same attitude towards racism that everyone has towards murder, which is that we will never get it to 0. And if you think we will, then grow up. Part of being an adult is recognizing what limits are inherent in human society so that you're not simply shaking your fist at the universe wishing the world were different, but you're actually making targeted and possible reforms to make things different. I think we can still reduce racism, absolutely. But if our bar for what it means to be, you know, a decent society is to have zero racism, then we are really in for we're in for an eternal battle against a foe that at some point will be too small to be worth worrying that much about. And here's the other thing: America is the third largest country in the world population-wise, and that is a very, very important and overlooked fact. Because what that means is if America were identical, but the size of Canada, which is 10 times smaller, we would have 10 times fewer racist incidents per unit time on the news. And so the very fact that we are so large and there are so many interactions between people, billions and billions of interactions between people every day. Think about that. There are billions of social interactions between Americans every day. And I don't know how many interactions there are between police and civilians, but it's got to be at least in the hundreds of thousands, if not the millions per year. And what that means is that if a racist incident has a 1 in a billion chance of happening to a given person on a given day, it will happen twice a week to some Americans somewhere. And if there's someone there to catch it on their iPhone, then it will be on the news twice a week. And we will think we have an epidemic of something that actually has a 1 in a billion chance of happening to any given person on any given day. And that's not true of smaller countries.
I wonder what, when we're talking about reforms and when we're talking about not eradicating, but I guess lessening racism, what kinds of reforms are we talking about? You know, like what would you say people should be focusing on, and what would be a productive or some productive things that people could be focusing on, maybe that, you know, they're not focusing on in terms of actually, again, you know, making change in terms of this issue?
Institute independent bodies to investigate and discipline police departments. As my friend Camille says, when an airplane crashes, they don't investigate themselves. There's an outside body of experts that investigates what happens, because we wouldn't trust the results. So we need to find some ways to create institutions that can hold police accountable, so that it's not police deciding whether police should be punished. And that's already happened in some places, and the idea can be taken too far. But as of now, I think it hasn't been taken far enough. So to me, that's a clear opportunity for reformers to just attack that issue at full force. Body cams. I don't see why every cop in America, shouldn't wear a body cam. It's worth noting that sometimes the body cam is going to be helpful for the cop, because when they get accused of police brutality and we see that they were actually dealing with a psychotic suspect on the camera, then there will be no doubt. The body cams will always tend to side to militate for truth and justice. And so to me, that seems like a no-brainer. I would also caution against viewing any of these things as a silver bullet. As I said, last year, 9 black unarmed Americans were killed by the cops. That's already in the single digits. To get from 9 to 0 seems to me very difficult, much less to keep it at 0 every year, given how big we are as a country, given that we're a country with more guns than people, which means that, unlike in other countries, when the American police pull up on an American suspect, they have a rational fear that that suspect is armed, which means that they are more likely to mistake the wallet for a gun, even if they're not poorly trained. So I think none of these things are a silver bullet in terms of police reforms, but those are two things I would strongly advocate.
Cool. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Again, I really appreciate it. It was super interesting, and it was nice to touch base with you. I've been following your work a bit. So
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Cool.